Over the past couple of months, I have made mention of, even written a newsletter article describing the fact that I've been doing a fair amount of fishing at a local lake, and been doing so with considerable success using nothing more than hot dogs, just hunks of hot dogs. I've been catching big bass and catfish, and it's been a lot of fun. And in any given week over the past couple of months, I'd say at least 3 nights a week, it'll be myself and the boys out on that dock just trying to fish for an hour or so. And we've had a lot of fun. But along the way, we've gone through a lot of hot dogs. Early on, I discovered that Aldi, a little small grocery store, they have like the cheapest hot dogs. You can get, I think it's 8,000 hot dogs for $3.39. And I think it's essentially potted meat in a tube, but the fish seem to be okay with it. And so I've been making multiplied trips to Aldi, but candidly, I don't really like shopping at Aldi. I don't know if you've ever been there or not, and I'm not trying to knock them because they've got some really great prices. But in terms of a shopping experience, I don't find it to be altogether pleasant. For one thing, if you don't have a quarter, you can't get a shopping cart. If you've been there, you know how that works. So in addition, if you don't have your own bags that you come with, you have to either buy them or get a box that they have lying around to carry your groceries from your car into your house. So that's kind of aggravating. But the thing that I find to be most aggravating is that Aldi keeps open fewer checkout lanes than Walmart, which is saying something. I was there on a Saturday just a couple of weeks ago, and the only thing I was buying was a pack of hot dogs. I go to the back, I grab those, and I head towards the checkout lane, and there's only one lane open on a Saturday afternoon, and the line is, I would say, 10 to 12 people deep when I get into it. It stretches from the cash register through the open part and then down into a shopping aisle. And I'm thinking, it's Saturday. That's a pretty big grocery shopping day, and they've got one cash register open. And so I just stand there and I wait my turn, and the line continues to advance slowly, but then the line's getting longer back behind me. And then all of a sudden I see this Aldi employee go over to a second lane, and she finally opens another lane. Now, what should happen? Well, she should say, those at the head of this line come over. Is that what she does? No. And so what does the end of my line do? They all jump over there, and I'm just furious, calling down God's wrath and judgment on them. Anyway, I didn't like the fact that those who were waiting in line the longest were still having to wait. But they did finally open another checkout lane, and for that I was grateful. I really was. It could have happened sooner. It should have happened sooner. But when they finally opened it, my thought was this: it's about time. It's about time. I want you to hang that thought in your mind for just a moment, and then open your Bibles with me to Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4. We're going to look at just 2 verses of Scripture, actually zeroing in on the end of verse 26. But as you're turning there, let me set the stage for you. Adam and Eve, you recall, had 2 sons, Cain and Abel. And you recall that in what was apparently a fit of jealousy and rage, Cain kills, he murders his brother Abel, so that Adam and Eve now have only 1 son. That is, until you get to verse 25 of Genesis 4. There we read that Adam knew his wife again. She bore a son and named him Seth, for God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. All right, so Abel is dead, and God blesses them with another son. Later in chapter 5, we read that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. Might there have been daughters prior to Seth? It's possible. We don't know. The Bible just doesn't tell us. But we do know that God gave to them this other son, Seth. And verse 26 tells us that Seth is blessed by God with a son, and he names this son Enosh. We've got a baby boy that's due in December, and we've been trying to come up with names, and Enosh is not one that has thus far ranked very high on our list, but that's what Seth chose to name this son, Enosh. And after Enosh is born, again, we're told something very significant. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. I recognize that a lot of people don't like significant portions of the Old Testament. For one reason, they say, well, that's just boring because there's so many lists and genealogies that so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. Especially once you get over into Chronicles, you've got these lengthy lists of genealogies. And if you're trying to read through the Bible or read through a particular book of the Bible that includes these lists, oftentimes we can kind of just cruise on through them thinking, well, there's really nothing here of significance. Quite frankly, what we read here at the end of Genesis 4 and in the first part of chapter 5, it's a list of genealogies. And very easily you could cruise through them thinking there's nothing here of significance. But in so doing, you will miss what is very significant, which is at the end of verse 26. Again, then people began to call on the name of the Lord. Now that statement gathers more significance when you continue to read on into chapter 5. Look with me at verse 3. There we're told Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. So chapter 5 at the beginning is giving us more detail about what we have just read. So Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel. Abel is killed. They have just Cain. God blesses them with another son. This time it's Seth. And Adam is 130 years old when this child is born. Now when you read a statement like that, very easily you could think, 130? I don't know that I want to have a kid at 30, much less 130. And with that as a thought, I want to just pause there for a moment to deal with what I believe to be a regularly recurring question relative to the Old Testament, specifically when ages are mentioned. And we read, for example, here that Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, that he was 935, I believe it was, when he died, or that Methuselah was 969 years old when he died. You read these ages and you're like, holy cow, how is that even possible? And you could say, after seeing statements like that, either they did not count time then as we do now, or this is the stuff of myth, legend, and fairy tale. Well, to both of those suppositions, I actually disagree with those. And I believe there's a reasonable explanation as to why we see these lengthy ages, at least in the early parts of the Old Testament. And so, to understand that, keep in mind a couple of things. And the first is this. When God created Adam and Eve, He created them perfectly. They were absolutely perfect. They and their bodies were designed to live forever. Their bodies were not subject to disease, to death, to decay, to wearing out. They were created perfectly. Their bodies genetically were perfect. As the cells in their bodies would replicate, there would be no mutations, no deformed cells that would produce cancerous tumors. That was not going to happen. But then sin came into the world through Adam and Eve, passed not to them, but to all those that would follow, and sin affected everything. They and all who would follow them all of a sudden became mortal beings, which is to say that the clock started ticking. Death became a future certainty. But keep in mind, they were created perfectly. Their bodies absolutely perfect, free of any mutations, any genetic deficiencies whatsoever. It therefore stands to reason that if you were created perfectly and all of a sudden stuff bad begins to happen, that it's going to take some time before those mutations, before those cells replicating, can begin to cause a problem that may eventually result in death. Based on what the Bible says relative to these ages, it was taking in excess of 900 years. Well, there's a second thought you should keep in mind, which is this. In Genesis chapter 6, we're told that after the flood, so after Noah and the flood, the lifespans are limited to 120 years. And that's not an exact time frame, but roughly 120 years. And when the flood occurs, you remember who it is that survives it. It's simply Noah, exclusively Noah and his family. That's the population of the earth at that point. You have a very, very small gene pool. And all those that would come after would come from that very small gene pool. When you have a very small gene pool, does that not make genetic mutations, genetic deficiencies, all the more common, all the more consequential? After the flood, consequently, lifespans become considerably shorter. But again, we're talking and looking at a passage here this morning that's pre-flood. They're having these longer lifespans. And so when you see a number like 130 or 969, don't let that be necessarily off-putting to you. So to put all this together, actually, Ann has helped me with some slides this morning. I want you to see this because these little details give us and paint a picture for us that makes what we're told at the end of verse 26 more significant. Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born. Seth was 105 when Enosh was born. All right, so we can go to the next slide, and then we start doing some math here. That means that Adam was 235 when Enosh was born. How'd you like to be a 235-year-old grandparent? So Adam was 235 years old when Enosh was born. Then we are told, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. Does that not make that statement all of a sudden have a bit more significance? 235 years pass, and finally, people began to call on the name of the Lord. 235 years. That's an awful lot of time, isn't it? It's 2,820 months. It's 85,775 days. That's an awfully long time. Now, I recognize this morning that we are dealing with some fairly scant details, but there are a few things that we do know. First of all, Adam and Eve, before sin came into the world, they had perfect fellowship with God. You remember that they would walk with God in the garden in the cool of the evening. They had perfect fellowship and consistent, regular, daily intimacy with God. But then you remember after they sinned and sin came into the world, that changed things dramatically. You remember that paradise was lost. They're kicked out of the garden. Fellowship with God is absolutely broken. Beyond that, as we just talked about a moment ago, the clock started ticking for them. And all who would follow, death became a future certain reality. In fact, I believe that it is at original sin that time begins to be calculated. Because quite frankly, time is only consequential when there's a limited amount of it, right? Well, beyond that, we also know that sacrifices and offerings were being made to God. You remember that from Cain and Abel, that they have offered these offerings to God. Cain's was rejected. Abel's was found to be acceptable. They're going through these exercises once sin came into the world of giving to God offerings and sacrifices. Now, again, we're also told in verse 4 of chapter 5 that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. If you're 235, you've probably got an awful lot of sons and daughters. Perhaps a slew of other daughters whose names obviously are not mentioned. Enosh does not have to be the first or certainly the only grandchild at this point. I think it is perhaps entirely logical and even reasonable that world population at this point is numbering in the thousands. And for 235 years, all of these people, they're doing the perfunctory work of sacrifice and offering, but no one is calling out to Him. No one is experiencing intimacy with God. Seemingly no fellowship at all. No one is praying. No one is calling out to Him for 85,775 days. I don't know how many times I have read this passage before and cruised through that verse, and it, until this past week, never struck me. But finally, after seeing that and looking at these ages, it dawned on me this very weighty question. What took so long? Why 235 years? People are going through the perfunctory work of sacrifice and offerings, but nobody's calling out to God. There's no real fellowship. There's no closeness. There's no pursuing Him. Nothing whatsoever. Well, again, we are working with the scarcest of details, but I think one of the first logical references that we can deduce is this, that people are operating with this mentality. they really messed things up. We really messed things up. Things had been at one point perfect between mankind and God, but then because of sin, it just messed up everything. They lose the garden, they lose perfection, they lose immortality, they lose all of that, and I believe there's a part of them that had this as the mentality. Things are so messed up, things are so horribly broken, there's just really no use in trying. Maybe you've experienced something like that in the kitchen. Perhaps it was that you sought to bake a cake and you've got your recipe card out and you begin to assemble all the different ingredients. You start pouring them into the mixer and you turn the mixer on, you mix everything. You've made a great batter and you pour it into a cake pan. You put it in the oven. And with about 5 minutes left to go as that cake bakes, this little thought comes to mind. I didn't put any sugar in that cake. Has that ever happened to you? You recognize that at that point you cannot take that cake pan out and just sprinkle the sugar on it and things will be okay, right? At that point things are just too far gone. I really believe that's part of what's at work there. People are thinking things are just too far gone. We have so messed things up. What's the use in calling out to Him? What's the use in trying to experience fellowship with Him? We've so messed everything up. As a subset of that thought, I believe one of the things that would have naturally stemmed from that were perhaps overwhelming feelings of guilt and remorse. It's not simply that they realize, we have so messed things up, but they feel so badly about it. They say, God gave us perfection. He gave us paradise. And we lost it because we decided we want to be as smart as He is, or think that we can be as smart as He is. We've messed it up, and I feel so bad about it. I feel so guilty about it. You've experienced this in your own personal relationships, haven't you, where you have done something wrong towards someone, and that offense and the guilt that you feel over it causes you to avoid them. You've experienced that, haven't you? To make a long story short, I actually shared this back a few years ago, that Nathan, when he was in kindergarten, the teacher had in her classroom some bins of various little items that she would use for counting exercises. And among the things that she had in one of the bins were these little ceramic tiles. And so she would use those with the students to teach them counting, addition, subtraction, all that stuff. Anyway, Nathan comes home one day, and Caroline notices that he's got a handful of these little ceramic tiles that we don't have around our house, and he's playing with those. And she asks the question, "Where did you get those?" And Nathan says, "Well, this boy at school gave them to me." Well, that sounds reasonable and plausible, so she lets that slide. And then she notices over the next couple of days that he's continuing to play with these things, and it seems as though there's more of them. So at that point, she begins to press the issue. And finally, Nathan is so seared by his little kindergarten conscience that he admits the fact that he had stolen them from the classroom and made up this lie about his friend giving them to him. Well, this became a very traumatic experience for Nathan. He got a spanking for the lying, but he didn't actually get a spanking for the theft. What I did was to take him the next day to school as he's going to go, and he has to hand these to his teacher and explain to her that he stole those, to apologize and say that it will never happen again. It was worse to him than going to the electric chair. It was just terrible. That was kindergarten. Nathan is now in the 4th grade. Just a couple of weeks ago, we'd already put the kids to bed. I'd gone outside for something. I come back in through the garage, and I come into the kitchen, and Caroline is in the den, and she says, "Come in here, Nathan needs to talk to you." So I go into the den, it's just Caroline and Nathan is sitting there on the love seat, and he's got tears coming down his face. And I said, "Nathan, what's going on, buddy?" And he says, "Daddy, you remember when I stole those little squares from Miss Pierce's class?" I said, yeah, I do. And he said, "I didn't give back all of them." He said, "There were some that I kept hidden in my room. And after all that happened, I felt so terrible about it. I felt so guilty about it that what I did over time was to take one or two of them and put them in the trash can. He's destroying the evidence without trying to draw any attention. And over a span of nearly 3 years, Nathan gets rid of all these little tiles. And by this point, Nathan is just sobbing. And he said, I have felt so guilty about this. I have felt so terrible about this. But I was so afraid of telling you all what I had done. I had done something so bad. That's years, from kindergarten through 4th grade, that he has been vexed by guilt over this. So what did we do? Well, we called the police, and Nathan is on parole doing community service. If you see someone in a little small orange jumpsuit on Hilltop Road with a trash bag, he's actually not picking up trash, he's destroying evidence. That's not what we did, though. We comforted him. We assured him of our love. We praised him for finally being candid and honest with us, and explained to him that this was an issue that had long since in our minds been settled. But in his case, lingering feelings of guilt, that affected his relationship with us. There was a part of him that said, I have done something so bad, I have messed things up so miserably, there's no going back. Because of what I have done, there is a part of me that I simply cannot expose to those that are dearest on earth to me. Does that not stand to reason that something like that is exactly what was going on in the days of Seth and Enosh? We have messed things up so horribly bad, and we feel so guilty over it. We're just going to we'll go through the perfunctory work of sacrifice and offerings, but in terms of trying to pursue fellowship and intimacy and really talking to Him, well, that's not going to happen. Could it be maybe that this morning you feel some small way that you're in that same boat, feeling some of those same thoughts today? Perhaps others do not know it. In fact, maybe it is that you would be mortified if those closest to you knew exactly what all you had done and how horribly you have messed up. You're aware that they do not know, but you're also keenly aware that you haven't pulled the wool over God's eyes and that He implicitly knows what has been going on. And maybe because of that, you have been rattled with oppressive feelings of guilt, sincere feelings of remorse, and you've thought, you know what, there's just no use in trying to fix this. So in terms of you calling out to God, that just doesn't happen. Well, if that is where you find yourself this morning, I know this is simple, but it is the truth. God does not want you to stay in that state. I believe absolutely He wants us and has wired us and desires us to experience feelings of guilt when we have wronged and when we have sinned. But He doesn't want us to stay in that state. He does not want us to feel those feelings so that we remove ourselves from Him. Rather, it is that becomes a motivation to go to Him. Furthermore, His promise is as clear as black letters on white paper. Maybe you just need to be reminded today of what God said in 1 John chapter 1, that if you confess your sins, He is faithful and just to forgive your sins and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. Maybe it is that you need to hear the words of the Old Testament prophet, though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall become like wool. These are the promises of God. Do not let your failures and sin keep you from Him. Let that be the motivation for you calling out to Him. But for 235 years, they just didn't. They didn't. I think because part of them thought, you know what, they had messed things up. But there's another reason I think that we can logically deduce that prompted their delay, and that's this. The effects of or a realization of the frailty of life highlighted their need. The recognition of the frailty of life began to highlight their need. All right, so follow me in this. When Enosh is born, Adam is 235 years old. 235 years. Now, he had experienced time and life there in the Garden of Eden, spent with no decay, no death, no physical decline, nothing of the sort. But then after original sin occurred, then everything changed. It changed for him, for the world, for all those that would follow. The first awareness of the consequence and the frailty of life became evident to Adam and to Eve. You remember, after they sinned, the first thing they recognized was, we got no clothes on. They were naked and they felt ashamed. And so, do you remember what God did? God took an animal's life, and from that animal's hide made tunics, coverings for them so that they could cover their naked bodies. They saw death for the very first time. With the passage of time, the continuing, rippling effects of sin began to become even more evident and clear. Weeds began to take things over. Lightning could cause destructive fires, and floods could destroy entire fields of crops ready for harvest. Adam and Eve could see death in the animal kingdom as larger predatory animals would find their next meal by feasting on a smaller animal, witnessing this for the very first time as a consequence of sin. Beyond that, almost certainly animals were used by Adam to plow the fields. He'd worked with oxen, perhaps donkeys or mules, maybe perhaps rode a horse. And over time, what Adam began to notice is that these oxen are not getting stronger, they're getting weaker. This horse is not as fast as it used to be. And he recognized that these animals are aging, they're declining, and eventually they die. While sin not only introduced pain into childbirth, it almost certainly brought about for Adam and for Eve an introduction into infant mortality, where Eve or one of her descendants would give birth to a beautiful little baby, but then almost instantly discovered that this child has no life, that it was born, stillborn, because the cord was wrapped around its neck. When Adam was 235 years old, Enosh was born, and Adam would be able to live for another 695 years. But you've got to think that at 235, Adam's starting to feel the effects of age, isn't he? That he's not as strong as he used to be, that he's not as fast as he used to be, that his sight is not as clear, that his hearing is not as sensitive. Now, though he was going to live another 695 years, I don't think 235 is the new 30. I believe that living was beginning to take its toll on Adam's body. And after nearly 2.5 centuries, he was coming to grips with just how frail human life is. In short, what I'm saying is that Adam and his descendants are finally coming to grips with the frailty of life. They began to see that tragedy could come about very unexpectedly, seemingly out of nowhere. That living beings do not progressively get stronger, they eventually get weaker. They began to see that life here is at best temporary. That our bodies, though strong today, can become mortally ill tomorrow. This recognition of the frailty of life, I believe, finally dawns on Adam and Eve and Seth and the others that were alive at that point, and they recognized we are in a woeful state and we need some help. We need some help. And the frailty of life highlighted their need for help, and they began to call out to the only one who could give it. I'll be 41 years old in February, and I know that there are many others today that can speak to a far greater degree of the effects of aging on their body, but even at 40 and a half years old, I'm beginning to see and experience some of that. And it's not simply that I'll wake up one day with some long white old man eyebrow hair, which I still, where does that come from? It's not simply that, and it's not simply that I use contacts or glasses to see at a distance, but I'm getting to the point now where I use readers as I study, that I can't see the kids' toes or fingers to clip their nails without some reading glasses. I recognize I'm not as fast as I used to be. I also recognize I'm not interested in being fast anymore. I recognize that the longer I stand, the more my knees hurt. But there's something even more significant that is on a more regular basis getting underscored in my mind. And it's this, and it's very simple, but it's consequential in my mind. It's not simply that I'm getting older, so too are those that are dearest on earth to me. I think about my parents and Caroline's parents. Caroline's parents have already crossed the 70 mark. My parents have been on Social Security for 3 years now. And I wouldn't say that they're old, but they're not spring chickens anymore. And there's not a whole lot of spring in their steps because each of them has either had at least a hip or a knee replaced. Some have already had cataract surgery. Arthritis is beginning to affect their bodies. And on a more regular basis, I'm coming to grips with this fact. They're not going to be with me forever, at least here. That becomes more personal to me as I look at my own children and I say, they're not going to be with me forever, at least here. This past week we were at the beach, and on Tuesday night I went to see some friends who live down there in Conway. Their names are Cecil and Wanda, and Cecil and Wanda I came to know because they were at the church I served in Charlotte when I first came in 2001. At that point I was 26 years old, and Cecil I think had just turned 70. And so though those multiplied decades separated us in terms of age, we just very instantly just kind of clicked. And Cecil and Wanda became some of my dearest friends. And I just loved them. They loved me. Loved Caroline when she came into my life. And in 2004, about the time that Caroline and I were getting married, Cecil and Wanda wound up moving to the beach. She had a brother down there. They moved down to the beach. And since that time, they had been to our home in Charlotte. We had been, if we go to the beach, we'd spend some time with them. So we'd been in each other's homes. And consistently, at least, if not weekly, at least every 2 to 3 weeks, I would call and talk to them on the phone. We've just remained dear friends over all these years. Well, I knew in the course of conversation that Wanda had been experiencing some recurring melanomas on her legs, these little skin growths that would begin to show up as a discolored mole. She would go to the doctor, and they would cut these out, sometimes some significant cuts to get them out. And she would think she's doing fine, and then another one would show up. Well, back a number of months ago, they found a new melanoma that was all the more consequential, and they said to her, we cannot cut this out. The only surgical solution is to remove the entire leg from here down. And Wanda decided at this stage in life she's not going to do that. And so what she opted to do was to take chemo treatments. Well, in the past couple of months, Wanda went through 2 rounds of chemo treatments, and they made her so horribly sick that she wound up being in the hospital 4 different times because she was so deathly ill. Finally, she got to the point where she told her oncologist, I cannot do this anymore. I can't do this anymore. And so I went to see them on Tuesday night, and early on in the conversation, Wanda shared with me that she said no to any more treatments. Quite frankly, at this point, the melanoma has spread to the point internally where it's at the base now of her hip. You know how melanoma works. You know how aggressive it is. And what she said was, I'm just going to let nature run its course. The surgery's passed. I cannot go through that chemo anymore. I'm just going to let nature take its course. And so we continued to visit. We continued to talk. And that night I left their place, and I remember walking to the van, and I had this thought. I have seen Wanda for the last time. In all likelihood, I won't be making another trip down there. They can't come up here. I have seen her for the last time. And that stinks. That stinks. The longer we live, the more it is underscored to us just how temporary we are, just how fleeting our relationships are, just how frail our bodies are. What I'm saying in short is that the frailties of life underscore we need some help. We need some help. And it causes us to finally, if we pay enough attention, to call out to the only one who can help us. 235 years had passed. 235 years, and finally, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. The delay, I think, is because they thought we've messed up so bad. The delay was caused because I don't think they had come to grips with just how in need they were, how frail and fragile life is. But finally, when they come to grips with that, they call out to the Lord. You know, our bodies eventually will succumb to fatigue, exhaustion, disease, and death. We'll lose people that we love. Those that love us will eventually lose us. That stinks. And as unpleasant as those realities are, they have an altogether positive goal. They remind us of our limits. They highlight our need. They underscore the reality that we just plain need some help, and they point us to the only one who can give it. If you find yourself this morning finally coming to grips with this, I've got some good news for you. Do you remember what God through Jeremiah said in chapter 33, verse 3? Call out to me, and I will answer you, and I will show you great and mighty things that you have not known. They, for the first time, finally begin to call out to the Lord. And what do they experience? They get perspective. They get insight. They get guidance. They get wisdom. They get help. But most of all, they get hope. It took 235 years, but finally they began to call out to Him. It was about time. It was about time. Let me ask you this morning very simply this. Do you find yourself at all consistently calling out to Him? If the answer has been, or up until this point has been no, let me just say very simply, it's about time. It's about time. Will you bow your heads with me? If you've been in church long enough,